Okay, guys, this is part 3 of our notes discussing the war in the Pacific Theater and the atomic bomb. So, we haven't talked about Japan in a while. Let's fix that. Japan has been fighting a war with China since the 1930s, and before that, they were conquering areas in East Asia like Korea and other islands in the Pacific. So, they've been at this for a while. But they're going to start to get concerned about America. The United States has clearly picked a favorite team, and that's the Allies. So even before they're involved in World War II, they are selling weapons and supplies to the Allies, and they're not selling them to Japan. So Japan gets pretty annoyed that they're not getting any more iron, steel, and oil products from the United States. So they decide that they will launch a secret attack on the United States at their naval base of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Hawaii wasn't a state yet at this point, but it was the site of America's largest naval outpost in the Pacific Ocean. So Japan's idea is to launch a sneak attack, destroy the entire American naval fleet that is in the Asian area, and therefore keep us from fighting in World War II. They're going to destroy our entire navy, so then we won't be able to do anything to them. Unfortunately for Japan, it had the opposite effect and just made America angrier. So December 7th, 1941 is the date of Pearl Harbor, and President Roosevelt is going to famously refer to it as a date which shall live in infamy. Infamy is when something is famous for being really, really bad. And the very next day, in a show of solidarity, Congress unanimously passed a vote to declare war on Japan. So now America is officially part of World War II. Now, part of World War II is going to involve not just fighting in Europe, as we talked about in our last video. If you're at this video, thank you for following through on all of those. But it's also going to involve fighting the Pacific, which has a lot of islands. So that leads to the island hopping campaign, basically just trying to get closer and closer to Japan, one island at a time. General MacArthur is the one that is in charge of this mission, and it's really difficult because with each island, there's very intense fighting, huge loss of life, like hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers are dying at every single island that they have to take. And you can't just skip one because then you're leaving enemies behind you. Um, One very famous image from this island hopping campaign is this photograph that is now a famous statue at the Marine Corps Museum and also in DC. There is this image of Marines lifting an American flag on the top of a mountain in the island of Iwo Jima, okay, which was the site of a very bloody, long battle in the Pacific. Now, one of the reasons why fighting was so intense in the Pacific theater was because the Japanese have this very particular idea about what it means to have honor as a warrior. And for my AP students who are listening, what is the code of conduct that Japanese samurai are supposed to follow? Anybody? Wow, you did it! You're right. It is Bushido, or the way of the warrior. So for the Japanese, this comes from a very long cultural history where surrender is something shameful and something that you never do under any circumstances. Your options as a Japanese soldier are win or die. That's the only acceptable situation. So there are many times in which Japanese soldiers will fight to the death, even though surrender makes a lot more sense and would save the lives of their men. They don't care. That imagery of Bushido combined with all of the new 1930s and 40s propaganda that the Japanese government was putting out really did a good job of brainwashing Japanese soldiers and civilians that surrender was not an option. So the fighting here is going to be very intense, and it's only going to get worse as we get closer to the Japanese homeland. So at the same time, while all this stuff is going on in Europe and the Pacific, many countries, including the United States, are working on developing even more deadly weapons that will give them a chance of winning this war. And that starts the atomic bomb. So the atomic bomb is going to be developed in a secret project called the Manhattan Project that's conducted basically out in the desert in the American Southwest, led by scientist Robert Oppenheimer and many other leading scientists of the day. And their job is to create the most deadly weapon known to mankind. Okay? It's more deadly than anything we've ever seen before. It can kill thousands of people instantly with just one bomb. And they weren't 100% sure if they could do it, so this was very experimental. But the Nazis, the Japanese, everybody was working on trying to develop something like this at the same time. America just happened to be first. So this also is going to lead to nuclear energy. The discoveries that we encounter with the development of the atomic bomb, we're also going to later use to power plants. So nuclear energy is going to be used to develop electricity and other things that we use on a daily basis in the modern day. Now, the atomic bombs are only used in war twice in the history of the world, and that is during World War II on the city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then 3 days later on the city of Nagasaki. These are both cities on the Japanese mainland, and they were targeted for particular reasons that I will talk about a little bit later. But this is, again, the only times that they've ever been used outside of a testing, no people around situation. So people really weren't sure just how it would work when you dropped it on people or on top of a city. And this is what ended up happening. The left picture is a before image of one area of Hiroshima. You can see this church right here in the foreground. On the right, you can see the same church, only now it has no roof. All of the glass and doors have been blown off. Half of it has disappeared. And look at all of the other devastation around it. Very few buildings remaining standing. Almost everything completely collapsed. The devastation from this bomb was truly incredible. Nobody really knew how badly it would be. Uh, the initial site where the bomb went off reached a heat 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. So that is an intense wave of heat. Any people that were around at that epicenter of the bomb, they died instantly. They were incinerated. But when I say incinerated, I mean that there were no bodies for us to recover. They were dust, just basically disintegrated to atoms. The only reason we even know those people were there is because their shadows have been burned into the stones and the rocks where they were standing. That's how hot we're talking here. Many people further out from the epicenter of the bomb are going to be killed by extreme burns or by buildings collapsing from the aftershock effects of the bomb. So it's very likely that you died from a fire caused by the bomb or from a building collapsing on top of you. And then in the weeks and months later, we're going to have people dying from other effects of the bomb, such as radiation poisoning or even cancer developing. So it was incredibly deadly. Not just the people who died instantly, which were thousands of people, but the many thousands who died later on. We can continue to see that destruction here in the photo on the left, showing a very Japanese archway to a shrine and all of the devastation around it. This image on the right, again, just going to that idea of the intense heat caused by this bomb, it was very common for people who suffered severe burns to have the design of their kimono, their silk robes, burned into their skin, almost like a strange tattoo, probably much more painful than a typical tattoo. Now, the reason why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the cities targeted by the atomic bomb, it came from the fact that they were both fairly large cities. They both had engineering and industrial centers. They created a lot of products for the Japanese military, but also because neither one of those cities had been bombed previously in the war. The capital city of Tokyo had been bombed several times, and there is an argument to be made that they wanted to be able to measure the effectiveness of these new bombs by testing it on sites that had not suffered previous damage from the war. Now, Truman decided to drop the atomic bombs on Japan because he felt that they were the only way to stop the war without huge American losses. Again, going back to that idea of the Japanese Bushido code of conduct, never surrendering, never giving in, no matter what the cost. And he knew that if we were going to try to invade Japan in a typical fashion, like with our island hopping campaign, thousands of Americans and thousands of Japanese people were going to die. That did not seem like a reasonable price to pay. There is also the argument to be made that many historians tend to go with this explanation that Truman had the atomic bomb, so of course he wanted to use the atomic bomb. Or another argument that Truman used the bomb so that he could end the war before the Soviet Union could get involved with fighting Japan, and therefore end the war with an American advantage, as being the only country with an atomic bomb showing their effectiveness and kind of intimidating all the other players. Now, there's a lot to be said for all of these different historical arguments, but we're going to make sure that for the purposes of our notes, we stick with this one here that is mandated information by the state of Virginia. Japan ultimately is going to surrender to the United States on September 2nd, 1945. And again, they were offered opportunities to surrender before each of the bombs were dropped, but Bushido, man, you can't surrender. It's not allowed. Now, Emperor Hirohito is going to be the one to officially issue that surrender, and he's going to announce the surrender on Japanese radio. And the Americans actually keep Hirohito around. They recognize that the emperor has a very significant impact on Japanese culture and on Japanese way of life, even though he doesn't have a lot of political power. So they actually allow him to maintain his authority as emperor, though of course they're going to limit the power and get rid of the Japanese generals like Hideki Tojo that led them into the war. We're going to stop here. Next time we will talk about the Holocaust.